Thank you, and thank you, Bob. We've never met. We haven't even said hello yet, but I was checking off points I wanted to make while you were speaking, so you've made my job a bit easier. I wanted to use this little bit of time to make 2 points, if I can. First of all, the system, and this echoes some of the things that Bob was saying and some of the things that Lisa was saying. The system is very large, it's very complex, and it's dynamic. It's bigger than just the energy commodity production and distribution system, even though that's the industry and that's the regulatory community that's most heavily represented in this exercise. The decision-making system itself is complex enough. The energy commodity delivery and distribution system is complex enough, but it's embedded in an even larger system, which is what I think of when I talk about the energy system, that extends all the way back to the origins of the demand for these commodities and so on, and it's in a state of enormous transition right now that is causing disruption all the way down the train. I think it was, don't quote me on this because I'm not sure if it was Henry Ford, but I think he said when the change outside gets bigger than the change inside, you're in trouble. Well, there's a little bit of that going on here because so much of the disruption in the energy commodity industry has its origins outside of that industry. So the first point then is it's really important in your business planning and in your strategic thinking to make sure that you're getting the boundaries around this system drawn large enough. This is something that is sometimes referred to as the Eisenhower principle. When somebody asked him, how did you come up with that strategy for D-Day? He said, anytime you have a problem that seems too big to solve, make it bigger. The second point that I wanted to in some ways the larger point, goes to this question of that we've been asked to address in this panel, which is, are we getting the balance right when it comes to government authority to make decisions? And it seems to me that authority derives from consent. And the consent for some types of behavior to be allowed and other types of behavior not to be allowed in the society, that comes from largely, I would argue, and David Runnels touched on this last night, and I think one or two other speakers did as well. When there is a strongly held and widely held shared narrative in the society, individuals, households, firms, communities will sacrifice a great deal for that greater good. They'll even sacrifice their lives. When that shared narrative starts to fragment or falter or be challenged by a new narrative which is taking root, then consent for the old ways of doing things gets harder to achieve, and government authority gets harder to impose. And I think, to a large extent, that's what we're witnessing in the energy system writ large. There is a new narrative which is taking root. It's the post-fossil fuel narrative. It's fledgling, admittedly, but it's come a long way in the last few years, and it's gaining momentum. And that's nowhere more true than in the municipal governments around the world, hundreds of which are now using the low-carbon future as a way of focusing all of their economic and community planning goals and aspirations. Against that, we have the status quo narrative, which is the fossil fuel-driven narrative that has formed the basis of our prosperity and our economic growth over 100 years now, and it's faltering. So the greater good is no longer perceived as being maybe quite so great or quite so good. And so it makes it harder to get consent, to make commitments to that narrative, especially if they're irreversible, especially if they're very large, especially if they impose costs on individuals or communities for which they're no longer confident that the benefit is there. So the nature of trust, it's not a personal thing. I mean, it gets that way, unfortunately, in some of these conversations. It's actually a question of confidence in our vision of the future. And so I guess I'm using my little bit of time to reinforce those who have said, We need to keep trying to understand and develop where it is that we're going, because the basis for consent of all kinds of behavior flows from that shared understanding of what we're trying to achieve. And I would say, first of all, it's going to be a while before that happens. So if you are operating as a business or as a regulatory agency, you need to figure out how to proceed and how to get things done and how to make decisions and how to build stuff in an environment that will continue to be unpredictable, that does not even admit to the concept of balance. It's a complex dynamic system. It's not an equilibrium system. It's just going to keep changing. I'm sorry. It's not actually bad news once you accept it and start to figure out how to work with it. But this idea that we can somehow take this mechanical system and find a balance point and live happily ever after in that space, not going to work here. So, and this is nowhere, as I was saying, more true than in the municipal sector, and perhaps nowhere more true in the municipal sector, unfortunately for the proponents of this pipeline, than in the lower Fraser River Delta, where we have a city that has set as its goal becoming the greenest city in the world by the year 2020. That's commitment to the new narrative. And into that effort and into that vision, which is shared very strongly in the Lower Mainland, as many of you I'm sure can appreciate, comes the prospect of becoming one of the world's largest heavy oil exporting ports. You're not going to reconcile those views. So we have a system that's out of balance, it's in transition, and we need a decision-making system that probably draws less on the principles of mechanics and more on the principles of ecology. How do we make decisions given that this is going to remain uncertain, it's going to remain dynamic, and it's going to remain in transition probably indefinitely?